Harry. Harry, I've killed Kay. It's all mixed up, but I know I shot her twice. Harry, am I insane? Could I have shot through Alucard and killed her without hurting him? Tell me what happened. Well, I shot right through him. I shot right through him. As Kay screamed and fell, and he just stood there. Just stood there staring at me. Just staring at me.
Good evening, guys and ghouls, and welcome back to Monster Craze Memoirs, a generational podcast about B-movies. I'm your host, Ian Garcia, and joining me for the first time in about a month is my father, Rocco.
Hello.
Rocco has, of course, been away for a while. His workload, we're both full-time workers, so, this podcast always takes a little bit of schedule finagling for both of us, so he's been indisposed for a while, but he had to come back for
my favorite
this episode. We're going into our second month of the of Universal's second cycle of horror movies. Obviously I haven't had the opportunity to really delve into some of the lesser known B programmers that Universal made during this time. Certainly their Mummy movies, their Invisible Man movies. Universal was really, under the studio regime of Nate Bloomberg and Cliff Work, they were really churning out these horror movies pretty quickly every year. But I've tried to concentrate more on the main Frankenstein and what was becoming the kind of Wolfman franchises, more just because I feel like there's a more straightforward story being told with these films in terms of the establishment of a new vogue of horror, not as a vehicle for, something I keep coming up to over and over again when doing these movies, is that horror no longer as a vehicle of exploring themes of the Gothic or of monstrosity, but really horror as a vehicle for monsters themselves. And I think as we get further along in these sort of monster mash movies, we're going to see the steady and self-conscious transformation of these monsters into more or less icons of the studio. This very self-conscious not pandering, but a catering of these movies to a younger generation of moviegoers who are going to these movies for the more visceral thrill of seeing monsters that they identify with and that they, that have this sort of iconic presence in the American film landscape, whether this is achieved through new movies or through revival screenings of older ones. We're obviously not in the era of television yet, but that will in turn spark for a new generation a new fascination with these classic horror movies. But Son of Dracula is, a bit off the beaten path as far as this new cycle of Universal horror B movies, because it is sort of a return to form in the sense of being geared more towards the Gothic horror variety than to a more action-oriented, visceral style of filmmaking.
Right.
And
an attempt, right.
Yeah. And you in particular wanted to come back to this for this one, especially just because it was a personal favorite of yours.
It is a personal favorite. Can I digress a little bit, or do you want to continue?
No, you can go ahead.
The reason one thing I want to mention, some of this is age dependent. It's a lot of things. I'm 70. So when you see films, I'm trying to think of, when you see films like this, or Stand By Me, although Stand By Me is a much better film, the Rob Reiner Stand By Me, I guess, and those kinds of films, or even the It series, Stephen King's It, not the book, but necessarily the screen adaptation, although poorly done, there's something about that's invoked when you have the idea of young friends getting together and then having these kinds of melodramatic themes that pop out, where they all have to come together and resolve these things. You have to remember, from my point of view, when I see this movie, we didn't have any kind of platforms that you can go on. We had to explore. So most of the day we were out. We did things like this. We went into sword drains and went for maybe 500, 600 yards in the storm drain and pop out somewhere in the middle of the street, looking at cars passing over us. That's the kind of crazy stuff we did when we were kids. And we went down, abandoned places where we shouldn't have gone. So when I hear some of the themes of this movie, I don't want to give them away because I know you want to address each one of these. That's what I feel when I see this movie. And I have to admit, it's poorly done. It's not really well done, but there are some interesting, what would you call it, set pieces or things that evoke that kind of emotion that I'm talking about. So go ahead.
Yeah, I think what you're getting, I was worried because it seemed like a bit of a non sequitur for a second, but I think what you're getting at is the idea of why do these even as we sort of acknowledge that the standard of quality has certainly gone down precipitously with this new regime of filmmaking, certainly since the Laemmle years. There's what you're getting at here in terms of why these films still hold such a great affinity among a certain generation, and it seems to be that they are, for better or worse, part of a tapestry of juvenile interests and adventures. So even when the movies themselves aren't necessarily of the best quality, there's something that they're still tapping into on a visceral level that draws in young audiences and stays with them. So a movie, me seeing Son of Dracula for the first time, for me, it's very much this thing where it's like I can acknowledge that there are certain concepts about it that I think are interesting, but ultimately it's very difficult for me to keep paying attention to the movie because, number one, a lot of the concepts in it I've seen done. Even just recently with the last season, I've seen concepts in it that have been done better in other movies, as well as this thing where I think that, it really is just a problem of execution. And it's a problem of execution and it's a problem of context. I think Son of Dracula is a victim of two things. One, it's not a matter of the director or the writers not caring. I've researched the movie enough to know better that they were trying to make something that, again, the director of the film, Robert Siodmak, he was very self-consciously trying to make something that was different from the more action-oriented and juvenile movies that Universal was pumping out at the time. He was trying to make something a little bit more cerebral in nature. So it's not really a problem of the specific creative voices behind the film, but it is a problem of the investment of the studio, the studio, the Universal executives of the time not really caring whether the movie is good or bad, not really being willing to put the time or investment behind them in the same way that Laemmle was. And there's also, I had also sort of realized when thinking about the movie and what I think doesn't work about it, I had also sort of neglected to remember the broader cultural context in which the movie was made, by which I mean, of course, referring to the Production Code Authority, which was much more stringently enforced during the 1940s than it was in the early 30s. And so there's a lot of things that I think the screenwriter and the director are trying to do with Son of Dracula that they're just not able to really explore because there's this very heavy-handed and puritanical censorship regime that's going on that's preventing them from really sort of getting under your skin in terms of the story that is trying to be told here.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about it, though, I know dovetailing on what you're saying about censorship, yet they're able to put a sequence in there having a kid being one of the first victims. And that bothers me. That bothers me personally, that so it's, you're right, but they didn't seem that didn't seem to bother them. So even though there could have been more, not salacious is the wrong word, but more intimate kinds of power drawn around the characters, especially between the the protagonists, you know, at the time, both Robert Page, Frank Stanley's character, and Louise Alberton's character, you're right. They're not developed. They're not fleshed out at all. But like I said, there's something about it just seems to me to be you're right. It isn't one of those slapdash kind of action-packed kinds of horror pictures. It's more cerebral. Unfortunately, they're trying to pull it off, like you just said, is a failing of the film. There's no doubt about it.
Even you mentioning like the fact that there is a child who was the first victim of the vampires, I think that even sort of condenses the sort of weird antiseptic quality that horror movies are forced to take on during this period. I had noted it previously in our episode on The Ghost of Frankenstein, where I had noted in writing about the movie how there's a part in the movie where the monster is on Ludwig's table and it's waking up from its comatose and it's going crazy because it's just trying to kill Ludwig. And then Ludwig has to use a syringe full of anesthetic or tranquilizer to pacify the monster. But we're not even shown Ludwig pushing the syringe into the monster's neck.
Right.
That sort of thing that might have been visually represented in a previous era of horror movies is now completely verboten under the new censorship regime, and and it occurs.
But is it necessary? Do you think?
Well, it's necessary for that scene because the way it's edited and shot now,
It doesn't look like where he's injecting.
Well,
right.
no, it's not that it doesn't look like where he's injecting. We don't see him injecting.
Right. You see the animal falling backwards.
Right. So so the thing with Ghost of Frankenstein is that it's neutered to the point where that sequence becomes borderline incomprehensible. You almost don't even register that that's what's happened.
Right.
And with Son of Dracula, it occurs to me that now that you mention that a child is the victim, it occurs to me that we don't ever see anybody being bitten by a vampire in this movie.
Right, and that's okay. It's more of a play quality where you don't really show it. That's the way I look at it, and it's okay. It's implied. That's one thing I wanted to mention to you that I forgot, that it has that play feel to it. There isn't a lot of action. It's a lot of cerebral interaction, a lot of dialogue, and a lot of lead the person by the nose. It's a poor play, but it has that play kind of quality into it, even though they try to attempt to go to more of a Gothic type of oeuvre, if you will, where they're trying to get to that kind of feel to it. And it doesn't work. It just doesn't work, and it's just you're right about that. But like I said, there is an appeal to it because of the elements that were inadvertently lost and sort of like they're diminished by.
Well, it's not so much lost; it's that they can't put it in the film because the censors won't let them do it.
That may be
the
part
censors
of it, yeah.
won't let them show. They're making a Dracula movie, and the censors won't let them show Dracula biting his victims.
Well, you didn't see any kissing in it either.
Exactly. Well, and that's the thing is like and that's the other thing about it is that like, more or less if you have to summarize Son of Dracula, the best way is like as a Southern Gothic romance. Really, this is a story, sort of faithful to the classic Dracula story. This is the story of well-to-do people in a particular setting here instead of England at the turn of the century.
What is the setting? I'm sorry.
It's now New Orleans in the modern day,
right?
And it's among this.
So it's like Interview with a Vampire,
it's among this well-to-do group of characters. Right. There's this imposter and outsider who comes into their midst, tries seducing a woman and surreptitiously claiming land, and so there is this sort of psychosexual triangle that's at the heart of the drama that is faithful to a Dracula story, but because of the constrictions that are put on them, they're really not able to visualize it in any way that is sensually legible to the spectator. You're constantly in this position where it's like, okay, so this is like a love triangle involving two rich people and a vampire, but there's no it's not sufficiently suggestive of the erotic element of it. There's
Right.
no
Well, there
real
isn't any.
there's no
Right.
real feeling of seduction or honest emotion. Everybody, everybody is always, it's like dancing at a Catholic prom.
Yeah, you almost-
it's like there's
you-
always room being left for the
Right.
Holy Spirit.
And and that what's bad about is that any kind of emotion that's displayed because of what you're supposed to have a deep interaction with these people falls flat.
Right.
So him shooting his wife to be doesn't have much impact,
Right, 'cause
because
we
there was no connection to begin with.
Yeah, we don't feel like we know enough about this character to know
It's
why
all-
he's invested in this
It's
relationship.
all verbal. We know they've been in love with each other since they were kids. That's it. That's all we know.
Right.
But there's no showing of it, right? Other than the fact that he tries to track down Dracula. Dracula doesn't care.
I also think,
Right,
and
right.
also, and we'll get into more of this later, but I also think that it's a fundamental problem of casting, because,
Yes.
Lon Chaney Jr., God bless him, he is not an erotic performer. He cannot
No.
portray the seductive aspects of Dracula.
Exactly.
Lon Chaney is very clearly a guy who always has to get love and sex earnestly. He has to bare his soul to someone and be an actually good person. He has never had to get a woman into bed through duplicitous means in his life. There's
Right.
there's a dishonesty to the movie that just sort of gets in the way
Yeah,
of
it's almost
everything.
as if he doesn't matter, though. Like I was telling, as we mentioned after the film, it's almost as if he's not even a major player, although he should be. But he doesn't seem to be. It seems to be that it's the interaction between Frank and Frank Stanley and Catherine.
Yeah.
That should be the thing, but it's so weak between them as it is, it all falls apart.
See, I think the part where Dracula is weird, this is one of those things where, again, I think the part where Dracula is weirdly sidelined in the story that's one of those things about the movie where, I acknowledge that there are things that are conceptually interesting about it. I like the idea, and again, we'll get into this a little bit more when I sort of talk about the kind of, just like I did with Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, I want to talk about the sort of narrative and aesthetic overlaps between the new horror movies coming out in this period and the film noir that is also very nascent during the early World War II period, where I think there's a way in which conceptually what's going on in Son of Dracula is very interesting, because you start to realize that at least the intent of the filmmakers at a certain point, and it's really more shoehorned into the story during the climax and isn't really effectively weaved or teased into it, but you sort of realize that the primary antagonist of the story is not actually supposed to be Dracula. This is supposed to be, the conceptually interesting thing is when you realize, oh, that was supposed to be a major twist, that this is not about this
Right.
horrid vampire overlord. This is about a femme fatale. This is about a woman
Right.
who is trying to lead a man into
Right. She tells
disarray.
him. Right. She tells him you have no choice.
Right.
And that's where he makes his decision, although poorly, because you never really know that he can't follow her.
Yeah, let's get into the plot synopsis, because I feel like we're already getting we got a lot of extraneous details, and I just want to make sure we tie them together. So. At a train station in New Orleans, Dr. Harry Brewster and young Frank Stanley, played by Frank Craven and Robert Page respectively, await the arrival of the mysterious Count Alucard, who is expected to be received by Frank's fiancée, Catherine Caldwell, played by Louise Albrighton. A morbid woman obsessed with the occult, Catherine had apparently met Alucard while on vacation in Budapest and has invited him as a distinguished guest to stay at her father's old plantation house on the bayou, much to Frank's chagrin. However, Frank and Dr. Brewster learn that while Alucard's luggage has arrived, no Count was on board the train, and before leaving, Brewster notes to himself that the name on his luggage, spelled backwards, is Dracula. So
Right, because it was upside down.
Right, not a lot of mystery from the get-go.
No.
Catherine is deeply disappointed when the Count fails to appear at the lively reception party she has thrown in his honor. Little does anyone know, however, that Alucard, played by Lon Chaney Jr., has indeed arrived, and in the dead of night transforms into a bat so that he can enter Colonel Caldwell's bedroom. When a fire is spotted coming from the upstairs window, the party is too late to discover that Caldwell has apparently passed away in his sleep, though Frank remarks that it looks as though he has been frightened to death, and Brewster calls attention to two strange markings made on the side of his throat. Alucard makes his official arrival a short time later, after all the party guests have been dismissed. Later that evening, unable to sleep, Brewster gives a call to Professor Laszlo, a venerable expert in Hungarian history and the occult, played by J. Edward Bromberg. In response to Brewster's inquiry, he alerts him that not only is there no noble family by the name Alucard in Hungary, Alucard is not even a Hungarian name. Brewster, on a hunch, then inquires about the name Dracula, and learns from Laszlo pretty much what we already know. The last Dracula was alleged to have become a vampire, supposedly destroyed in the 19th century. Be wary of this imposter going by the name Dracula. With Colonel Caldwell's demise, his last will and testament bequeaths to Catherine sole control of the plantation, whereas all the actual money goes to her sister, Claire, played by Evelyn Ankers. We learn that Catherine deliberately requested that her father make out the will in such a way as splitting the inheritance of both estate and capital equally between the sisters would only ensure that the plantation would eventually need to be sold off. Still, the family lawyer notes, without any investment capital, the plantation will be all but useless to her. This rash, secretive decision certainly serves to drive a deeper wedge between Frank and Catherine, and only arouses Brewster's further suspicion. Brewster compels Claire to show him to Alucard's lodgings in the guest house, where he is, of course, conspicuously absent. When they inspect his large traveling case, they discover that it contains no luggage, instead being weighed down by ballasts. That night, Catherine drives out to the swamp where Alucard's coffin rises from the murky waters, the vampire forming from a cloud of vapor in the air. They pay a visit to a local justice of the peace to be married in secret, and then return quietly to the plantation. Frank arrives and, upon learning what has happened, gets into an altercation with Alucard. Easily overpowered by Alucard, Frank draws his gun and shoots, but the bullets pass right through the undead fiend and instead mortally wound Catherine, who collapses on the floor. The horrified Frank flees into the night, and while almost falling prey to Alucard himself, eventually makes it to Brewster, who gives him a place to rest. Brewster decides to head out to the plantation himself, but discovers Catherine still apparently alive and well. She and Alucard coldly inform him that they plan to live in quiet solitude, taking no guests or pertinent business without express permission, and then only at night, with their days being fully preoccupied. The next morning, Brewster learns that Frank has turned himself in for the murder of Catherine Caldwell. When he attempts to clear up the mess, inviting the police out to the plantation to see for themselves that she is still alive, they instead discover Catherine's body resting in the family crypt, and now Brewster finds himself roped into the investigation of her suspicious death. Laszlo arrives that evening as Brewster's guest, and he gives him some more formal schooling in the myths of vampires and how to get rid of them. Alucard, revealing himself as Dracula, arrives in Brewster's office and attempts to kill the two of them, but Laszlo is able to ward him off with the assistance of a well-hidden crucifix. Meanwhile, Catherine, now a vampire, visits Frank in his cell and attempts to basically turn him into her Renfield, revealing that she plans to have him destroy Dracula so that she in turn can transform him into a vampire and the two of them can live together for all eternity. The next night, she uses her vampire abilities to free him from the courthouse, and sure enough, Frank makes it to Dracula's resting place in the swamp shortly before dawn. He lights the Count's coffin on fire, and in the excitement is able to distract him long enough to keep him out as the sun rises, causing him to die. Following Catherine's instructions, he then goes to the toy attic, which she has chosen as the place where they will consummate their unholy union. Always one step behind, the party of Brewster, Laszlo, and the befuddled police arrive to discover that, with Catherine's power over him apparently being undone by Dracula's being killed, her powers only being derived from Dracula's, that is, that Frank has set fire to her coffin too. and I mean, there's this, and again, like, I think breaking down the story that way, it sounds a lot more conceptually interesting than I think it plays out as. I think the main thing about the movie that I found very distracting was just how much Brewster and Laszlo are the centerpieces of the story, even though by the climax of it, they literally don't do anything. You know, so much of the film is given over to just exposition about vampires that I think a lot of it really isn't necessary. I don't think that there's a tremendous amount that needs to be explained. There isn't a huge amount of mystery. I mean, the very opening of the movie is just, it's very much like telegraphing to the audience to not take it too seriously when Brewster is literally right up against Alucard's luggage and looking at the lettering of it backwards. And like there's no subtlety or mystery created anywhere in it. So like, I'm not sure why all this exposition is necessary in the first place.
Well, the exposition is, again, most of it's filling in what should have been done by film and can't be done in 70 minutes. And probably could have done better in 70 minutes, as you mentioned, and you're right about that. It could be done better, but I imagine, like you said, with the pressures of the industry at the time, it probably was. This is the best they could have done to pull off what had a lot of interesting themes to it.
I think one thing to note that I think is like, and Tom Weaver, the film historian, has brought this up. Like, it's kind of weird because despite it being called Son of Dracula, obviously the title makes absolutely no sense. Like, it's just that's just the title that was used as the pitch.
Well, it isn't clear whether he is Dracula per se or a relative of Dracula. Maybe that's
no. I think he's definitely supposed to be Dracula, and I think
himself.
The thing that Tom Weaver notes is that the movie doesn't actually appear to take place within the timeline of the other Dracula movies, because Laszlo mentions that Dracula by legend was supposed to have been killed in the 19th century, even though in Universal's Dracula movie that takes place in the early 20th century. So there's this sort of like it
Right.
doesn't seem like the film is taking place within the same timeline, which is reinforced by the fact that we actually see Brewster in his study at one point literally reading Bram Stoker's Dracula. So
right.
I think we're supposed to take for granted that this movie takes place in a world where Dracula was real, but he sort of developed a legendary status. Some guy named Bram Stoker wrote a book about him, but like in reality, as opposed to in Bram Stoker's novel, Dracula was never really killed. So I think we can take for granted that Lon Chaney Jr. is supposed to be playing Dracula here.
Yeah, I just wanted to add the fact that I just thought that a lot of the set pieces were pretty interesting, and also there weren't outrageous special effects, but there's something peculiar, especially with Catherine's mist scene when she leaves the cell to go unlock and incapacitate.
When she's unlocking, when she's freeing Frank from prison.
I mean, there is something
jail.
very interesting about that. The use of mist. The other thing is when Alucard, Dracula, rises from the swamp, and haven't seen this done before, where he's floating on water and just sort of like.
Yeah, there's this.
It's all, as you see, as a point of view, and you're looking up at him. It's like he's supposed to be some totem of whatever.
Yeah, it's achieved in this very, like, yeah, I think there's certainly, obviously the worst special effects in the movie come when, like, you see, like, the bat that they're using to represent Dracula. It's some of the goofiest I mean, it's like, it's kind of hard to get goofier than the bats in the original Dracula, but, like, this one is way too,
clumsy.
There's this clumsy bat prop that they use to represent Dracula in his bat form that is not effective. But then that's counterbalanced by like scenes you just mentioned, especially when you first see Dracula rising from the swamp. It is very interestingly achieved.
Yes.
Like, and obviously it doesn't. Once we see what happens later, it doesn't really make any narrative sense. Like we later see Dracula's coffin just in like just in a completely different location, which looks like the drainage ditch of the swamp. So, like, the coffin isn't even in the same place as it is in that scene.
Well, that was probably deliberate because Catherine, we know by what do you call it? Exposition, tells Frank in the cell that I had him move to the drainage ditch to try to secure it there. But in reality, you know where it is and I know where it is, and you're going to go burn and kill Dracula. So I think,
Does
again,
she say she had it moved, or does she just tell him that that's where it is?
that's where it is. She tells him that's where it is. But I'm presuming that they worked out something. No sense rising from a swamp every day.
See, I think they
Yeah.
just. I think they
Well,
didn't really think of it. I think
no.
they look, and more credit to them. I think they just did the rising from the swamp scene because it looked cool. I think they did it because it was actually like a really interesting effect.
It
And
was,
like you say,
yeah.
it's like, and I like that, they do try to work in more elements of Dracula than were utilized in previous movies, including the idea that he can take the form of a mist. So, like, that, I think, if it weren't for Lon Chaney being the guy who the mist forms out of, it would have been a much more effective scene. But they do cap it off again with this very interesting sort of traveling matte shot where Lon Chaney is static, but he's superimposed over footage of a very wide, long tracking shot as he's slowly floating towards Catherine on the shoreline.
I was really impressed with the how do you say it, the depth of field and frame of focus. She's in focus while that's occurring, and vice versa when her point of view is at him floating towards her. I just thought that there was a pretty interesting piece of filmography, if you will, or film doing that. Cinematography.
And I think that's a good place to like mention, like, this, again, I had mentioned this in terms of Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, that movie was directed by Roy William Neal, and he would go on to be a fairly important director of what would become known as the film noir. And the director of this film, Kurt Siodmak, would also become a very important director of noir films. And, you see a very similar aesthetic, despite the content difference, there's a very similar aesthetic between both films. There's very heavy use of stark contrast between light and dark, a deep layering of shadow in compositions, a lot of use of deep focus photography. And I think that there's this extent to which that it's all, I wouldn't say that it's better to it's not so much that it's easier to understand Son of Dracula in terms of it being a noir, but it's easier to understand what the filmmakers were going for in terms of it being a noir. Because like we sort of alluded to in that synopsis, again, like it is really weird because Dracula by the latter half of the movie really is a total non-entity of the story. Basically, he tries to kill Brewster and Laszlo once, and then we really never see him again until the very end of the movie when Frank is trying to kill him. And we have this element where, again, it's this sort of reveal of Catherine as a femme fatale that really, and there's this sort of, and is a sort of ingeniousness of it to it. Like, and again, you wish that they had picked a more sort of sensual performer than Lon Chaney Jr.
and
to
more
be
sinister.
In the part.
Someone has more depth and range.
And there needs to be it more, just at a basic level, it needs to be someone who can be more because I think what they were going for here. And, other film scholars besides me have managed to pick up on this, but, like, it seems like they were much more, they were trying to go for a version of Dracula that was much more explicitly interested in things other than just, drinking blood.
Right,
They were trying to do a thing where it seemed like he really was sort of having a carnal fixation on Catherine, that there was some sort of seductive, physical, sexual relationship between them.
But in previous films, the Dracula had 3 wives, right? I mean, even in the original, there are 3 of them that rise with him, right?
Right, but they don't even sleep in the same bedroom.
No, of course not. Of course not. They're like Leave It to Beaver. They sleep in separate beds, like in the 50s sitcoms. The other thing that I wanted to point out about Lon Chaney, though, and it's interesting, probably because the director calls it, when the bat does transform into Lon Chaney, he does sort of like a jump. And I think that is beautifully executed, that he jumps, indicating that he's landed on his feet. And it's timed perfectly with the well, obviously not timed perfectly. It's probably done post-production or whatever you call it back then. But he jumps a little bit, indicating that when he transforms from the bat, he's landed on his feet. And I think that's something you haven't seen in other films. You haven't seen it with Bela Lugosi in any of his films when he transforms. But Lon Chaney does that repeatedly when he goes from bat into human. You can check that out.
And I mean, that's,
of course, there's a faux pas, as I mentioned to you, the first scene where he goes to
where
Colonel.
he, like in the very same shot where we see him materializing from the bat into, basically it's a very simple animated transition. Basically it's the same static deep focus wide shot of the hallway. We see the very bad marionette bat flying down the hallway in front of Colonel Caldwell's bedroom. There's, you know,
There's a hallway mirror.
They cut at the point where he's supposed to transform. They do a sort of black ink animations to materialize him, and then they cut to Lon Chaney Jr. sort of leaping into place as he's transformed from the bat into Dracula. But yeah, you had noted that you can still see Dracula in the adjoining mirror of the hallway.
He's not supposed to cast the
right,
reflection.
Exactly. Well, then again, Laszlo neglects to mention that vampires don't cast reflections.
But again,
I mean, they're playing.
You know, it's a critical scene in Dracula, right, where he holds where Van Helsing.
You know, shows Dracula he has no reflection, and
that
has a great
effective.
character moment.
Yeah,
and that's the thing, and
that's missing. Everything's missing from the film like this.
Well, yeah, that's the thing is like there's this imbalance to the movie where on the one hand you are right that we're seeing the film, and it does occur to me that you mentioned that really this is only like the third major vampire movie. Like, despite the fact that Dracula was a huge success and really kickstarted the American horror film as we sort of conceptualize it today, it seems that, you know, vampires weren't necessarily particularly popular subjects. Like a lot of other movies that had alleged vampires in them, they turned out to be using them as red herrings. They would just be regular people who were using myths of vampires as a misdirection from their malicious deeds. So this is really one of the first legitimate vampire movies that's being made in a while, and they do a lot of stuff that was not done in previous films in terms of really using special effects to try to depict all of Dracula's powers that we now sort of take for granted as things that are routine parts of the character. So there is that aspect of Son of Dracula where it is foreshadowing a lot of the cliches of Dracula in the context of this movie, where the critical thing that's lacking is, again, as you mentioned with the comparison to Bela Lugosi, our understanding of Dracula as a character.
Right.
You know?
Right. Exactly. Understanding him as a character. Absolutely true. Okay. Yeah. Right. There's not much more to say about it except the... Again, I think it's something worth. I like it. I think it's one of my favorites. I don't know why. Maybe because it's easy to follow, and I like the mix of characters that bring in all these different expositions, and informs people of it because you follow along, saying, you know, and it's sort of like a vicarious enjoyment and understanding. Yeah, I know that stuff too, and also the fact that there's an element of, and also a unique element, I think, of a femme fatale vampire wanting to get rid of her mentor or her, you know, and take over. And actually, she always loved Frank, and it's but she doesn't have a choice in it.
Well, yeah, and that's the thing. I mean, and that's the thing is that like
it's very interesting.
Well, that is interesting, and that's the thing is like once you realize that like, oh, this was her plan all along.
Yeah.
I think that's the thing is that, again, and that gets back to my point about censorship, is that there's this extent to which the filmmakers are trying to make a more cerebral film, but their hands are tied not only by the mercenary nature of what the studio is demanding, but by the fact that okay, we can't really tell a story about a love triangle between humans and vampires. We can't really tell the type of, we can't really tell the pseudo misogynistic story that we're really trying to tell, which is about just this evil woman who's just like, and that's the irony of the film. In a weird way, Dracula, it seems like the filmmakers even have a weird sympathy with Dracula, because it turns out Dracula was used.
He's been had.
He's been took. He's been bamboozled.
She is vicious. She even wants to get rid of her own sister. She's no use to us anymore.
Right.
Right.
Oh yeah, there's
in the cell, right?
Yeah, I had failed.
Wow.
Yeah, I had failed to mention that like,
she's really cold.
Because Laszlo and Brewster are planning to cremate Catherine's body, and they need Claire's approval. It isn't
quite clear why Frank all of a sudden becomes hysterical when he finds out that they're going to cremate her, because I think he already made up his mind he can't follow her. But at the same time, I think the reason is because he has to kill Dracula first. And if they kill her before that point, he'll never get Dracula.
Well, see, by that point, she's already bitten him and made him like a Renfield figure. So he doesn't have power over himself. So and again, this is the sort of thing where it's like, again, this is also one of the more, again, you see the gesturing of the filmmakers to try to make something a little bit more fantastical and evocative than a sort of B program action oriented movie, because the way that we see her infecting him is done very interestingly, where she takes the form of a bat. We see the marionette bat flying through the window and then off screen, but then the way her biting his neck is represented not through the bat but through the shadow of the bat doing the biting. Right. And instantly while I'm watching this, this is conjuring up like all of the things that this scene is clearly alluding to in a nostalgic way to like the classic movies of German expressionism. And I think, Robert Siodmak was an actual, German expatriate director. He was a very significant director internationally before Hitler rose to power, and then he had to come to Hollywood. Being able to work on Son of Dracula was really a kind of breaking in project for him, so that with the success of that film, he could have more opportunities to flourish creatively and try to make in America the same sort of more intelligent film career that he had in Europe. And so,
but the other thing I want to ask you about that, I don't want to interrupt your comments about Siodmak, but that's what I want to ask you. You think his knowledge of the rise of the fall of the Weimar Republic and then the rise of Hitler. This is 1943, the film has been played, and that was made. Do you think he carried over any of that foreign influence, that here's a foreigner, we got to watch our soils here in the U.S. for exactly the same kind of thing? I always wonder whether that was part of his direction.
Well, and I think there's, the Dracula story has always been about the fear of the foreign. Okay. So I think I think that's relatively consistent with the character.
Right. But you said that already in Dracula.
I mean, it's even in Nosferatu, and Nosferatu is a great movie, but it's hard to watch Nosferatu and not realize that the Count Orlok in that movie is very straightforwardly like a very grotesque anti-Semitic caricature. Right. There's even the element in Nosferatu about the idea that the vampire is spreading the Black Plague, which is obviously an allusion to the blood libel, the medieval blood libel against Jews, that they were responsible for spreading the plague. He's associated with rats, and vermin, but as far as what you're talking about as a part, as far as what you're talking about in terms of like the historical influence, the sort of historically contingent moment in which these horror films are being made, I think it's impossible to not note the development, and we see it in a rudimentary aesthetic way with this film and with Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, the influence of film noir, or the development of film noir as being a direct product of filmmakers who are being expatriated from another country, who are, coming to this one with the consciousness of the fact that there is this really vicious predatory, almost like demoniacal force of destruction that is literally just on the other side of the ocean, and carrying with them all of these anxieties and all of this sort of latent fatalism and lack of hope for the future. I do think that to a certain way that is imparted on at least these universal horror movies that are being made by these expatriate directors, in the same way that it would be imparted upon their noir films. Because I think in my episode on Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, the thing that I noted about noir is that I think what a lot of people get it wrong about noir films is the idea that they're morally ambiguous. I think, due to this limitations of the time, my point was that noir films, you couldn't make them ambiguous because there's such an immense pressure from a censorship point of view to always make a movie where there's a clear opposition between good and evil. Like, you can make flawed characters, but ultimately the actions of those flawed characters always need to point into the direction of bad people being punished and the good being redeemed.
Right.
And so what I think you see even in a sort of nascent way in Son of Dracula, what you see is, again, with its supernatural elements, it's a very prototypical noir narrative. It's about a young man, very forceful, very strong and independent in his character, but who is nonetheless finds himself within the thrall of this woman who is able to convince him that she really does love him when she's really just using him. And that the narrative of the movie becomes about this critical moment at the climax of the film where the intended question, not that I think it really imprints on the spectator in a deep emotional way of what he's supposed to be going through, but that inflection point at the end of the movie where is he going to submit? Is he going to become a vampire like her? Is he going to give up everything he believes about the nature of good? Is he going to become an evil predatory being like her? Or is he going to become the arm of justice?
Right.
Is he going to destroy this Lilith figure? And then, of course, what is the final shot of the movie? It's the sunrise. It's that this action made by this flawed character ultimately points into the direction of how we move out of darkness and into a more optimistic direction.
I mean, it's really a touching scene where he's touching to the point with a flawed film where there isn't enough time to build up any emotion because of the way it's done. The fact that he sits by her coffin for a while and looks at her. And then you have Brewster and everybody running in, and when he throws the door open, of course, the flames indicating another, like you said, a pseudo sunrise, if you will, on their faces, and they're looking at the flames. And it's really an interesting scene. The whole final scene is like that. It's quite touching. From an emotional standpoint, unfortunately, it falls flat because of the fact that we didn't have enough time to build a relationship with these characters. But it's like I said, it's one of my favorite for a number of reasons, and many of them we talked about here. Other than the fact of the time and whatever was the flaws in it.
At the end of the day, I think
it's worth being seen.
I think it is worth being seen, and I think at the end of the day, like, Son of Dracula being a very sort of compromised movie isn't sort of like, the fact of the matter is that hasn't been out of the ordinary for Dracula movies. We saw it with Dracula. We saw it with Dracula's daughter. For some reason, Dracula just seems to be a really hard nut to crack for filmmakers. There's always something that's going on in the background of the historical and so cultural circumstances when these movies that are being made that makes it really difficult for filmmakers to like really get it right, to really get the most out of these stories. So I think that can be said in terms of...
Do you think it's like a black mark against it? I mean, you're trying to think, when you think of Westerns, there's an ebb and flow in people liking Westerns. And you find the same kind of things where things that were done like in the 70s dropped off the planet and aren't really seen ever. And yet there are periods of time, like then you get Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid, which isn't a great film, all of a sudden rises to be the spectacle of, you know what I'm trying to say? And maybe this is something about the vampire movies, like you said. There's not even an ebb and flow. It just doesn't, like you said. There's something about it that's cursed. It's sort of.
Well, it's just
but the Hammer films did pretty well, right?
Well, the Hammer films do all right, and it's like, and that's the thing, is that like I think a lot of people would assign to the Hammer films as being like, they're much, again, it's like in terms of movies that are less gothic and more sort of action and viscerally oriented, the Hammer films are certainly a lot punchier. And the later films at least have a sort of over-the-top quality. But honestly, I don't think there's really a legitimately good, like, or at least fully realized Dracula movie until Francis Ford Coppola's. I think he's really the first and maybe even the only director who really, really has the opportunity, again, in a...
But he has more than 2 hours.
Well, he has more than 2 hours, but he has more than 2 hours, but he also has the legacy of his film credentials behind them, and he's also working in a filmmaking context where the censorship restrictions are just so much laxer. So it's like, oh, so now I can finally just do what Dracula is actually about, which, really it's not that complicated. What vampire stories are about is about messed up sexual pathology. They're about deeply ingrained fears of the foreign and the fear of this demoniacal guy from another country coming and seducing our women, and women being, what
I don't know. I mean, what I'm trying to say, you like, for example, in that particular film, Bram Stoker's Dracula, but done by Francis Ford Coppola, is the fact that you don't know what happens to Winona Ryder at the end. You don't know. She says, she tells the her boyfriend character, says, "Is that what you're going to do to me? Are you going to kill me the same way?" He says no, but he says no. But it's what's his name, so he can't act it for his life.
Keanu Reeves. In
that particular film. But the idea is, he says no, but obviously he has doubts when he says no. I'm not going to. And she's there lying next to the body of the creature she loves, and that's the way the film ends. It pans off, right? And it has that kind of complexity to it, and
well, right. Yeah. And like, that's the thing, is that, like, again, there's this ability to explore the sort of nuance and complexity of the story, this weird way in which why the same things that make vampires so horrific are also exactly what makes them attractive. And, in a movie like Son of Dracula, it's being made at a time where you have to extrapolate out of the vague suggestions of the movie what is going on at the level of the characters' motivations, because the way they're forced to make the movie, it becomes completely illegible. Wait, why is she attracted to Dracula? Why does she want to live eternally? It takes there needs to be a context in which the filmmaker is going to be allowed to show the spectator, this is why this sort of thing is attractive to people.
Like, instead of having to say, I'm a metaphysical person.
Right, exactly. Everyone else is a fool.
Right. Yeah, I mean, instead of saying it, you're right. I mean, I have to agree with what you're saying. Yes.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to leave it.
Yes.
I forget where we're going next.
I want to ask you a question. Do you think it's good to do the Western vampire movie, to add as a...
the Curse of the Undead?
Yeah. Do you think, what year was that? That's 50s, right?
That's in the 50s.
That's maybe too late.
I mean, I'm sure once we're getting into the 50s, we'll inevitably have time for, like, Curse of the Undead. I mean, who knows? We might just... If you want, we could do 2 Western vampire movies. We could do Curse of the Undead, and we could do the bad movie masterpiece starring John Carradine, Billy the Kid meets Dracula.
No.
Oh yes. Oh yes.
Oh God. Oh.
Hey, I
think I've seen that. Oh my God, that's horrible.
I think for now, once we're getting out, now that we're done with, we're putting Son of Dracula to bed. Again, interesting, or in the ground, interesting concepts, compromised execution. You really can't blame the filmmakers. Still some interesting allusions to what's coming formalistically and thematically in the American film landscape in terms of the noir film. This really is a sort of prototypical noir, a femme fatale story. But once we come back, we're going to have to get back into what Universal is really interested in making during this time, which is the monster rally movies. So Will you come back next week? Do you think you'll have time to record an
Well, I don't
episode?
know what we're doing.
Well, we're going to be going into the first monster rally. We're going to be doing a House of Frankenstein.
Oh, I saw that one. I mean, yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
I'll be
right.
back.
Well,
Yep.
we'll put a pin in that, and
Right.
thank you guys for joining us, and join us next week on
Goodbye.
Monster Craze Memoirs.